History is written by the victors. But the map is drawn by the survivors. Welcome to Atlas of the Eerie, where we chart the dark, bloody, and impossible coordinates the world desperately wants you to forget. There is a false sense of security in the digital age. We view our screens as barriers. A pane of glass that separates the tangible, breathing world from the cold, mathematical realm of code. If something scares you on a screen, you can simply pull the plug. The nightmare ends when the power dies. But what happens when the anomaly doesn't come from a server? What happens when the glowing text on your isolated, disconnected machine is being typed by someone who has been dead for 400 years? Tonight, we are digging into a case so utterly bizarre, so extensively documented, and so linguistically perfect that it completely fractured the minds of the academics who tried to debunk it. It is a story that bridges the gap between a classic medieval haunting and modern cyber terror. It is known as the Dodleston messages. And it proves that time might not be a straight line at all. The year is 1984. We are in the tiny, ancient village of Dodleston, near the border of England and Wales. Ken Webster, an economics teacher, was renting a deeply historical stone cottage with his girlfriend, Debbie, and their friend, Nicola. The cottage was a relic, built over the foundations of structures dating back to the medieval era. It was cold, it was drafty, and it was entirely unremarkable. Until Ken brought home a computer. It was a BBC Micro. By today's standards, it was an electronic dinosaur. It used cassette tapes and floppy disks for memory. It had no modem. It had no internet connection. The World Wide Web would not even be invented for another 5 years. It was a completely closed system. If you wanted text to appear on that screen, you had to physically sit in the chair and type it with your own 2 hands. In late 1984, Ken left a document open on the computer and went to bed. The next morning, he found a new file saved to the disk. He hadn't created it. Nicola and Debbie denied touching the machine. Assuming it was a remnant file left over by the previous owner of the floppy disk, Ken opened it. It was a poem. It read, "True are the nightmares of a person that fears. Safe are the bodies of the silent world. Turn, pretty flower, turn towards the sun. For you shall grow and sow, but the flower reaches too high and withers in the burning light." Ken deleted it, assuming it was a prank. A few days later, another file appeared. Then another. The messages started addressing Ken, Debbie, and Nicola by name. The language was strange, archaic, and bizarrely structured. Whoever was typing this was breaking into their locked house in the dead of night, booting up a complex machine, writing cryptic poetry, and leaving without a trace. To catch the intruder, Ken set traps. He locked the doors, sealed the windows, and laid out telltale markers. But the intruder didn't just bypass the locks. The intruder decided to make their physical presence known. Ken and Debbie began waking up to find their furniture completely rearranged. Massive, heavy wooden chairs were found stacked on top of each other in impossible, gravity-defying towers in the middle of the kitchen. The temperature in the cottage would plummet to freezing levels. Banging noises echoed from the empty cellar. And then, the physical messages began. Ken woke up to find bizarre, archaic symbols and words written in chalk on the stone floors. The haunting had bled out of the digital realm and into their physical reality. The prank was no longer funny. It was terrifying. Desperate for answers, Ken sat down at the BBC Micro, opened a blank document, and typed a question into the void: "Who are you?" The response he found the next morning sent a chill down his spine that he would never fully shake. The entity finally introduced itself. Its name was Tomas Lucas. And Tomas was incredibly angry. Tomas claimed he was the rightful owner of the cottage. He claimed he was currently sitting in his living room, writing in his journal, when a bizarre, glowing box of light suddenly manifested in the air before him. Tomas believed Ken was a powerful, demonic who had stolen his house and was using dark magic to communicate with him. Ken typed back. He explained what a computer was. He explained what a car was. He tried to explain the modern world. Tomas replied, fascinated but deeply suspicious. But the most horrifying part of the exchange was the date. When Ken asked Tomas what year it was, Tomas replied that it was the reign of King Henry VIII. The year was 1546. Ken Webster was a rational man. He assumed this was an incredibly elaborate, highly sophisticated prank by a university student or a bored neighbor. So, he took the printouts of Tomas's messages and brought them to Peter Trinder, a respected linguist and historian. Ken wanted Trinder to find the linguistic flaws. He wanted him to prove it was a fake. Peter Trinder analyzed the text. And his conclusion completely shattered Ken's reality. The text was not modern English pretending to be old. It was grammatically flawless, 16th century regional English. Tomas was using highly obscure dialects, sentence structures, and vocabulary specific to the Cheshire border region in the 1500s. Words that had been entirely extinct for centuries. Words that were not in any local library. Trinder concluded that to fake these messages, the prankster would need to be a world-class, postdoctoral scholar of early modern English linguistics. They would need to understand the exact phonetic spelling of a specific farming village 400 years ago, and they would need to maintain that perfect facade across thousands of words of conversational dialogue. Driven by the impossible linguistics, researchers dug into the historical parish records of the Dodleston area. They searched the archives from the mid-1500s. And they found him. Tomas Lucas was a real person. He lived in Dodleston. He owned land exactly where Ken's cottage was built. And he was alive in 1546. Ken and Debbie were completely trapped in a multi-temporal chat room. They would write messages to a ghost, leave the computer on, and find replies waiting for them. Tomas described his life, his fears, and his utter terror of the glowing box. But just as they began to establish a bizarre, cross-century friendship, the computer screen glitched. And someone else started typing. The new messages were not written in 16th century English. They were not written in modern English. They were cold, incredibly advanced, and entirely devoid of human emotion. The new entity did not have a name. It only had a number. It called itself 2109. The entity known as 2109 claimed to be from the future. Specifically, the year 2109. They informed Ken, in chillingly detached language, that Tomas was not a ghost. And Ken was not haunted. They claimed that 2109 was conducting a massive, multidimensional experiment using tachyon technology to bridge different points in the time-space continuum. 2109 explained that they were using the primitive computer in 1984 as a relay point, bouncing a signal back to Tomas's consciousness in 1546. They told Ken that he had a purpose to fulfill, that he needed to document everything, and that if he tried to expose the true nature of the experiment to the wider scientific community, they would sever the connection completely. The situation in the cottage devolved into pure psychological horror. Poltergeist activity spiked. Debbie claimed she felt invisible hands grabbing her in the dark. Footprints of large, medieval boots appeared in the dust of the empty cellar. It was as if the fabric of time in that specific house was tearing apart at the seams. Ken broke the rules. He contacted the Society for Psychical Research, and eventually, the BBC. Investigators flooded the tiny cottage. They swept the house for hidden wires, radio transmitters, and remote-controlled keyboards. They found absolutely nothing. The BBC Micro was completely isolated. But the messages kept coming. Tomas began to grow desperate. In his timeline, the local villagers had discovered his glowing box of lights. They accused him of witchcraft. Tomas told Ken he was going to be arrested. He was terrified of being burned at the stake. He begged Ken to use his modern magic to save him. But Ken, sitting helpless in 1984, could do nothing. And then, 2109 intervened. Angry that Ken had brought in the media, and claiming that the experiment's parameters had been compromised, the entity from the future sent one final, chillingly brief message. They announced the termination of the project. And just like that, the connection was severed. No more files appeared on the floppy disks. The poltergeist activity instantly ceased. The house in Dodleston became nothing more than a quiet, drafty stone cottage again. Tomas Lucas, wherever and whenever he was gone. Left to face the wrath of the 16th century completely alone. Ken Webster eventually wrote a book detailing every single interaction, printing the transcripts verbatim. The book, titled The Vertical Plane, became an underground legend. Skeptics, naturally, called it a brilliant piece of fiction. A hoax designed to sell books. But the evidence refuses to die quietly. Linguists still study the Tomas texts today, unable to explain how an economics teacher faked a flawless, extinct 16th century dialect. Ken and Debbie passed multiple polygraph tests. They never asked for money. They never tried to turn the cottage into a tourist trap. They simply packed up, moved away, and tried to forget the glowing box. The Dodleston messages force us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about the nature of our reality. What if ghosts are not the spirits of the dead? What if a haunting is simply a bleed-through? 2 points in the timeline folding over, allowing the past and the present to briefly stare at each other through the static. Today, we are surrounded by screens. We have supercomputers in our pockets. We are constantly connected to a massive, invisible web of signals. We assume every message we receive is from a server, a bot, or a living human being. But the next time you get a strange text from an unknown number, look closely at the words. Because if a primitive BBC Micro in 1984 could act as a router for a man standing in 1546. Imagine what the machines we have today are capable of catching in the dark. Tomas Lucas is gone. 2109 is waiting. And time is not a line. It is a circle. This has been Atlas of the Eerie. If you want to uncover the dark corners of the map the world wants you to forget, hit subscribe. Until next time, keep looking over your shoulder.